Good morning. I'm Melina, co-founder of JusticeApp, and I am here with Stephanie Brown, Executive Director of Casa Myrna. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Stephanie, to talk a little bit more about Casa Myrna and the work that you guys do.
Happy to be here.
So just to start off, can you share a little bit about your organizational history and Casa Myrna's mission?
Sure. So at Casa Myrna, we believe every relationship should be safe and healthy. And so we work to end domestic violence through intervention, like providing services and supports to survivors, through education, so educating our community about domestic violence and how to end it, and through prevention, so trying to prevent and promote healthy relationships. Trying to prevent domestic violence and promote healthy relationships. So we were founded in the mid 1970s in Boston's South End by predominantly Puerto Rican activists who were going door to door to mobilize around access to education and jobs and schools for their kids. And these advocates who were going around, as they were knocking on doors, there were women home during the day, and they found out the number of them were in abusive relationships. And so they changed their focus and created a domestic violence organization. And so they really believe that everyone should have a healthy relationship, and that we don't need to have domestic violence in our society. And so we've been working towards that ever since.
So you guys have a long history in the community. And it seems like you've been doing such important work. Can you talk a little bit more about how the organization has evolved and the type of services that you provide today?
Sure. So we started in the 70s having one shelter. So the advocates were doing, mostly women, were doing sort of one-on-one support of other women and survivors. And they bought a building and staffed it with volunteers 24/7. And it became sort of a respite facility or a shelter, emergency shelter for survivors. And then over time, it's grown. So we now operate the statewide domestic violence hotline, which we call SafeLink. We have a legal helpline that supports survivors and advocates around predominantly family law issues across the state. We have 3 shelter programs or residential programs. We have housing advocates and resources that help people move from homelessness or at risk of homelessness into housing that they can afford and permanent housing and stability. We work on economic stability with survivors. We have counseling. We have programs for kids. And we have general community advocacy. So we have advocates placed in community organizations throughout Boston so that survivors don't have to find us and they don't have to come to us. That if they're, talking to their medical professional, they can learn about domestic violence and they can talk about what kinds of supports they might need. So we've grown a lot over the years, sort of at the direction and the needs of survivors.
Can you talk a little bit more about the connection that you have to the community? I'm assuming, given that you really grew from activism of women in the South End, that you still maintain some sort of connection. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, community is really, we think, central to our being able to do our work. Most of our staff live in the community. They're from the community in which we work. We recently moved from the South End to Dorchester's Grove Hall. So we're thrilled about being able to be in that community because that's where most of the survivors we work with are from Dorchester and Roxbury. Most of our staff live there. And so we are rooted in our community. So folks can drop by our office. Well, not now during COVID, but outside of COVID, they can drop by our office and talk to somebody, if they need support or they want information about healthy relationships. But we really think that we can't do this. There are too many needs. We can't do this work without our partners. And so it really takes a community to end domestic violence. And so we need everyone speaking out against it. We need, flyers and posters up everywhere about what healthy relationships look like and how to engage. We don't want people to have to find us. We want to be everywhere. But we also know that we shouldn't meet every need, or we shouldn't even try to meet every need. Right. That, the healthcare profession, the legal profession, schools, childcare, all of those, the people in those systems can be educated about domestic violence, and we can help provide that training, but they should be on the lookout for abuse and know what to do and how to refer people to us. So partnership and community are really integral to the work that we do.
Right. And I imagine that none of this is not without some challenges, right? You've taken on quite a bit. And it sounds like you're handling it all wonderfully. And from my personal experience, working with you guys in the past, through professional networks and getting to know your staff, there is nothing that you guys do that is short of amazing. But can you talk more about the challenges that you do face in the work that you do?
Sure. I think, one of the biggest challenges we face is just around lack of information and education about domestic violence. I mean, I think that's global. It's not just us. And so, yeah, we definitely need partners and folks in our communities and across the state to be able to speak out about domestic violence and about healthy relationships and engage other people, to make sure that survivors know that there is support and they don't have to stay in an abusive relationship, and that there is help for them, at the other end of a phone line or a chat line, or if they want to drop by a domestic violence organization. But I think that, some of the biggest challenges, particularly now with the onset of COVID, they were always there. We always knew about them, but a lot more people know now. People are seeing sort of the inequity in access to housing, and the fact that, more and more survivors are becoming homeless because of COVID. So we are seeing survivors who and their families who, lost their jobs. And when you're a survivor of domestic violence and you're already living under that pressure, any added pressure can make that relationship even more abusive or harmful to the survivor. And so we're seeing, we've been helping folks out with rent arrearages and security deposits and trying to help people move into safer housing. And so we're definitely seeing, the biggest challenges are around access to housing that survivors can afford, support in leaving an abusive relationship, and really like support in leaving a relationship in the way that they want to leave. And so we never say that every survivor should leave and you should cut ties with your abuser, because people's lives are really integrated. And it's really important that survivors sort of lead what it is that they want to happen. Most survivors just want the abuse to end. They don't want the relationship to end.
Right.
And so, some of the other challenges that we see around that, for the reasons that survivors get trapped in abusive relationships, is because like they can't afford housing, they can't afford to leave. And so we also, one of our biggest challenges is making sure that survivors have access to jobs that pay a living wage. And so we do a lot of, financial literacy and try to connect folks to jobs, but we're always looking for partners who have jobs that, we can support survivors in placing them in those jobs. But really, like housing and employment are just integral to survivors' ability to leave an abusive relationship and become independent.
And you really touched upon so many important points there. And I think especially the issue of COVID right now, and how is it that you can reach survivors where they are, given that people, as it is, housing is an issue, pre the pandemic. Now, right, everything's sort of amplified. How are you, or can you speak a little bit to that, if that's an accurate assessment? And if so, how you're meeting survivors where they are right now, given the circumstances?
Yeah, definitely. I think amplified is exactly the right word for it. I think even when we look at the dynamics of an abusive relationship, domestic violence and abuse isn't always physical. In fact, like sometimes it never gets physical, but it's emotional and psychological and financial. And so we're seeing all of that, but we're seeing that escalate and we're seeing it amplified because people are basically trapped together. So, a survivor would normally be able to call for help or get some support or make a plan for leaving or talk to an advocate when they're at work or when their partner's at work. But when people aren't working or they're working from home, they don't have that ability to be able to reach out for support. And so so being really confined together, creates this dynamic where that abuse is amplified and it's accelerated. And so we're hearing from survivors that the abuse is getting worse, or it's moving from psychological and emotional to physical, or it's getting more physical or physical more often. And survivors are feeling trapped. And then I think then you add to that just this trauma that we're all going through around the unknown, around COVID and fear of, all of the health implications. And that's just making the emotional toll that survivors are going through even harder. And so what we're trying to do is, so we have not shut down. Our shelters are still open. All of our staff are working remotely, and they're spending more time with each survivor than they would have before. And so we are, for the most part, like meeting with people over the telephone or through video conferencing. But then our community advocates are delivering things to survivors. So if they need like gift cards for food, or they need clothes, or they need a birthday gift for their child, any of those kinds of things, like our advocates are out delivering things and meeting with people outside, like in safe spaces. but yeah, so we're definitely seeing everything is amplified, and the tension and just the stress is it's worse for all of us, but it's just even compounded more for survivors of domestic violence.
So given all of these challenges, what would you say is or are your biggest needs as an organization?
Yeah. So I think like our biggest needs always financial. That's not, we're a nonprofit. That's not a surprise. We've doubled in size over the last 5 years, and we still can't meet the need by ourselves. But it's also a good reminder for us that we shouldn't even try to meet the need by ourselves, that we can't end it as an organization. We need everybody. And so our greatest needs are really around partnership. We need more partners in legal services to understand the dynamics of domestic violence and be able to support survivors. We need folks to be able to do, clothing and diaper drives for survivors, and gift cards, and back to school, and Mother's Day, and all of those kinds of things that add like some normalcy to survivors' lives. We need folks who have our employers who would be willing to give jobs to survivors. Folks who have homes who would be really willing to rent to survivors. We can help provide some housing subsidy, and cover the rent, but we need people to take a chance on somebody who, maybe doesn't have a housing history or has really poor credit because their abuser has ruined their credit. We need people to really like be partners in educating themselves about domestic violence so that they can speak out against it. Because I can come out and say it, but people will be like, "Oh, well, she runs a domestic violence organization. Of course, she thinks that." So we need people's next door neighbors and their employers and their coworkers and their nurse practitioners and their childcare providers to really say like that's not okay, and this is what a healthy relationship looks like, and if you are being abused, there's help for you.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit about what you're most proud of? I know we focus so much on what's difficult right now, but like I said, you really are doing phenomenal work. So what is Casa Myrna most proud of in their work?
I think personally, I am most proud of like our staff. So we have over 100 staff now, and so quite half of them are what we call relief staff. So they work in our 24/7 programs, like a shift a week. So it's not like we have 100 full-time staff, but we have about 50 full-time staff. And like our staff are survivors. They are folks of color who have experienced oppression, who understand what it is that survivors are going through, and they are incredibly empathetic. They make sure that survivors are able to empower themselves, and that's one of sort of the tenets of the work that we do, is that survivors should feel empowered, and they should have dignity, and they should lead what happens to them. They get to decide. And so like our staff are the people that we work with. And so we really sort of lead with that heart and want to make sure that survivors get what they need from us. And so that's really what we're most proud of, is that we've been able to grow in the direction that survivors tell us they want us to. So we don't have like this grand vision where we know exactly where we're going to be in 10 years. We sort of move with the way that survivors want, and we are really committed to making sure that we are there for survivors when they need us.
So when a survivor comes to you, what could that survivor expect? What type of service, what type of care can they expect from Casa Myrna?
Yeah. So I hope that they will feel like they are treated with dignity, and that they really are the lead in that relationship. But relationship is also key. Like our work is not transactional. We don't have a checklist where we ask questions and then say, okay, you're eligible for this, this, and this. It's really, again, like relational. Like what do you need? What's going on in your life? I think one of the things that they can expect is that it also doesn't all have to be about domestic violence. So we often work with survivors who, yes, identify as survivors, but their needs are more around like housing and education and a job. And so we try to provide survivors with whatever they need. And it really is about building a relationship with them over the long term, while at the same time trying to make sure that they don't have to become dependent on us, that we can work ourselves out of a job so that survivors, can feel empowered and they can advocate for themselves. So we really want to give them the tools that they're looking for, so that they can advocate for themselves, so they can expect more in their relationships, so that they can be, independent and free from abuse. And that really means that, we'll move to however they need us. And so typically, like when a survivor would call like our community helpline or they talk to an advocate, that advocate is the hub for all of our other resources. And so we make sure that they're connected to whatever it is that they need. And if we can't provide it or we're not the experts, we'll connect them to people who can.
Awesome. And to wrap up here, can you talk a little bit about what justice means to you?
That's such a good question. I think justice isn't that kind of thing what you talk about it all the time and you say the word and you think you know what it means until somebody asks you what it means. So I was thinking about this. I think for me, justice is about equitable access to education, housing, employment, and opportunity. I think that's not a surprise based on our conversation. But it's also about equitable access to like freedom of movement and human rights and opportunity, like in our society and in our communities. It's also for me about reparation. So when someone is harmed by society or by a system or an institution or an individual, that the reparations they get are meaningful to them, so that they drive it. And at the same time that our society and our systems like work to ensure that injustice that same injustice doesn't happen to somebody else, so that while we uncover an injustice, or inequity that's happened to somebody, that we're also actively trying to prevent that from happening to somebody else.
Well, a big one. Yeah. That's great. And thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about the important work that Casa Myrna is doing and the amazing progress that you guys are making in ending domestic violence. So again, Stephanie Brown, Executive Director of Casa Myrna, we appreciate all the work you're doing and the time you've taken to chat with us.
Right. And we are so excited about the app. It's very
exciting. Oh, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.